Well, good evening, everybody. How are you doing tonight? Thank you so much for coming out here and joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to say thank you to Pat and Diane who are out there serving up that delicious bribery to bring everybody in here. I mean the ice cream. Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you, Pat and Diane and Steve, for what you're doing there. I appreciate it. I first got into all this stuff about 4 years ago. We had our son TJ enrolled in the elementary school near our house. And one day I went to go pick him up from school. I was kind of running a little bit late, so I walked over there pretty quickly. And I took a shortcut across the campus to get to his classroom. And in doing so, I took a shortcut through the library. They have a nice little library there. And I was kind of hustling through the library when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye and it stopped me dead on my tracks, just like that. And I looked over and it was this book, How Whales Walked into the Sea. And I don't know why, but I just instantly recognized it for what it is. It's a children's book on evolution, isn't it? And they got some nice pictures in here, like this. And when I saw this, a couple of things occurred to me. First of all, I'm just going to let you guys know that I'm going to be totally honest with you, all right? Everything in this whole series, I'm just going to be open and honest with you the whole time. But when I saw this, I was a little bit upset. I was kind of mad because I thought, since when are we teaching our kids that evolution is the truth, that it's a fact? Because way back when I was in school, I turned 50 this year, so I'm a little bit sensitive. We learned about the theory of evolution. Does everybody remember that? We learned about the theory of evolution? Right, so evidently I might have missed something. Well, I didn't make a scene in the library, I didn't do anything there, but what I did do is I resolved to learn everything I could about creation and evolution because I knew I was going to have to talk to my kids about this one day. And so I started studying it, and in doing so, I started to discover more of the broader evidence for Christianity. And you wouldn't believe what's out there. You know, in about the last 75 years, there's been almost a revolution in the amount of information that we have discovered, a lot of it coming from science, that supports the Christian worldview. I got so excited about it that I decided to go back to school so that I could make sure that what I was learning was really accurate and correct. So welcome tonight and to this series. I'm calling it Reasons for the Faith, some of the evidence for the Christian worldview. And notice that I'm starting to use this term worldview because I've started to realize, I think, that every one of us ought to have a pretty good idea of what worldview we believe in, and why, don't you think? As a matter of fact, those of us who are Christians, did you know that we're told that we should understand the evidence behind Christianity? Because it's not a blind faith. For example, Peter tells us in 1 Peter, he says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." Now, there may be some in here, I don't know, there may be some who are a little bit skeptical about Christianity, and if there are, I want you to know that you are so welcome here. Because I plan to just present this information as fairly and objectively as I can. And I can't deny that to some extent I'm going to be making a case for Christianity because I actually believe it's true. But what I can do is I promise you that I'll be respectful. Okay, and no matter what anybody believes in here, I'm not going to put anybody down. Nobody's going to put anybody down in here. All right? Tonight we're going to look at evidence for the existence of God. Next week we're going to go into creation and evolution. And the week after that we're going to talk about the historical reliability of the New Testament. That's it. You with me? Okay. Well, tonight, as we start looking at the existence of God, I'm inclined to put on my atheist hat for just a minute. Okay, and this is absolutely nothing against atheists or someone who's skeptical. I'm very serious about this. Okay? But I have some questions to ask you people. One hat is as good as another, right? So this is my hat, and I have some questions. I would like to know why you people seem to believe in a God. Really? I mean it. I mean, you can't see him. You can't prove he exists. As a matter of fact, I can disprove the existence of the Christian God in 30 seconds. Are you ready? I'm going to need your participation. How many of you in here believe that God is a good God? He's a good guy, right? How many of you in here believe that God is, what's your word for it? Omnipotent? All-powerful? Is he powerful? How many of you believe that? All right, tell me this. If God is good, how can he allow all the pain and suffering in the world if he's got the power to stop it? Huh? Look, folks, I can understand that back in the day when we were developing as a species, we had the disease, we had the famine, we had the pestilence, we had the hurricanes. We needed some kind of a deity to pray to beg for mercy and help us out. But now, science has filled in the gaps of our knowledge. We don't need the God hypothesis anymore, folks. There is no big man in the sky telling you what to do. Just live your life. Have fun. Life is short. Be a good person. Take care of the environment and so forth. But you don't have to worship some big man in the sky who's telling you you're not a good person. So, why do you believe in God? Well, I hope that after tonight, you might have a little more confidence to say something like, you know, I think it just makes sense, more sense considering the evidence that's out there. What do you believe in and why? I want to know. All right. Tonight, we're going to talk about 3 of the common arguments that Christians use for the evidence of God. We're going to cover the cosmological argument, the design argument, and we're going to wrap it up with a moral argument and a little discussion about good and evil at the end. That's it. All right? You ready? Okay. Cosmological argument goes something like this. It says, everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe once had a beginning, and therefore, the universe had a cause. And this argument has everything to do with how everything must have gotten here in the first place. And I would suggest that probably every single one of us at some point in our lives, probably when we were about this tall, went outside and looked up in the trees in the sky and we really asked ourselves in our hearts, I wonder how it really all got here, right? And I would say that every philosopher who ever lived on earth has asked this question. And very often when they ask this question, it comes up like this. Why is there something rather than nothing? Or why is there anything at all rather than nothing? And whenever the question comes up, the law, the principle of cause and effect always comes up. It goes something like this. It says, every material effect, anything that had a beginning, must have an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause. Translation, anything out there that is an effect must have had a cause. Makes sense. It's one of the foundational principles of science when we go out there and we investigate science out there in nature. For example, if we're hiking through the woods and we pass by a pond over on our right, and we see on the shady side of the pond there's a thin layer of ice on top. Well, we know that the cause of that was that the temperature must have dropped overnight low enough to form that ice, right? And that, by the way, is a pretty good example that we can believe in causes of things that we can't see, right? We do it all the time. We understand causes based on their effects. Okay? Let's take a look at this notion of adequate cause. This is important as well. If Steve were to get up back there in the back and lean against the back wall, that would not be enough of a cause to tumble the entire building over, right? Of course not. It's kind of silly. The cause needs to be adequate. Or if you moms out there, you're in the back doing some gardening and your 6-year-old girl goes out there and she says, "Hey Mom, I'm interested in science these days. I think I want to become a scientist and I understand science is concerned with cause and effect. And I want to know what caused me." You might say, "Well, I'm glad you asked. Your father and I were out here 6 years ago and we found you in the cabbage patch." She would say, "Mom, that is not an adequate cause for where I came from." Okay, cause and effect. We now know that the universe once had a beginning. And I'm not going to go into it too much because I don't know any serious scientist out there who doesn't believe that anymore. They call it the Big Bang. That's right, secular theory. But it wasn't always that way. Going into the 1900s, most everybody, science included, believed that the universe was at a steady state. In other words, it was basically eternal. But when we get to the work of Einstein in the early 1900s and then Hubble confirming his work, we found out that the universe is expanding. And this is big news because that would mean that it is not at a steady state. And it would imply that if we go back in time a little bit, it was smaller, and it was smaller, and it was smaller. As a matter of fact, the Big Bang Theory tells us that it eventually comes down to a small point called what? The singularity, right? And according to the theory, we actually approach a point of zero volume. So if we have zero volume, how much matter can we fit inside there? None. So really, secular Big Bang Theory would tell us that all of the matter in the universe came from nothing, presumably energy, pure energy. Okay. We also know that the universe had a beginning because of the law of thermodynamics. Scientists understand that the universe as a whole is gradually winding down. It's losing usable energy. It's like leaving a flashlight on your dining room table overnight. You come back down the next morning or out the next morning and the light bulb is very, very dim, right? Or burned out because you've used up all the energy. That's what's happening to the universe. If the universe has been eternal since the beginning of time, then all of the stars would be burned out by now, and there would be an even distribution of heat throughout the entire universe. Okay, so scientists know because of that it must have had a beginning. One last thing is also due to thermodynamics, we know that material things tend to decay over time. A material thing. And those of us who have been bachelors in the past know what happens when you leave a head of lettuce in the refrigerator too long. Guys, is it 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Material things decay, and it's not pretty. All right. Now, if the universe had a beginning, it's only natural for us to ask, what was the cause? Okay. Now, using a series of reasonable steps of logic, with a little bit of science, we can come up with what are some of the characteristics that must be part of the cause of the universe. Okay? That's our process for tonight. You ready for this? All right, first one. It's a question. Would you all agree with me that if there was ever a time that there was nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing at all, there would still just be nothing? Why? Because there would be nothing to start the Big Bang, right? There'd be nothing there to start anything. Well, that tells me that whatever started it must be something that itself does not have a beginning. Why? Because if it had a beginning, then before that, there would be nothing at all. And if there's ever a time that there's nothing at all, there would still be nothing. Okay? So we would say that that cause of the universe is something eternal with no beginning. Now that tells me that it must be something that is not material or physical at all. Otherwise, it would be subject to the same laws of decay as the rest of the material universe, wouldn't it? So we would say not physical or material. Let's look at the notion of adequate cause. All right? Think of all of the energy and the power in the universe and all the stars. whatever caused this thing must have been something with enormous amounts of potential energy, right? We could call it all-powerful. That's pretty reasonable. And one more thing here. I would suggest that nobody knows. Nobody knows what was going on, say, the Wednesday before the Big Bang. If it even makes sense to talk in terms of time before then, and it probably doesn't. But we do know that there was something there, something that caused it. And we also know, interestingly enough, the Big Bang was a single event. And that's really important, because that tells us that whatever was there before it must have reached a decision point to act. Okay? It was there, and it must have thought, you know what, I think that tomorrow afternoon I'm going to start this thing off. That tells us that whatever it was must have been a conscious thing that was thinking and had the ability to make a decision. And we would call that personal. Okay? We have a couple of objections to this because cosmology is filled with a lot of speculation about what was going on before the Big Bang. And one of the more common ones is that actually what we're dealing with is an oscillating model. This is one of the more common ones, and it tells us, all right, yeah, the universe is expanding, but it's going to contract and compress and expand and contract, and that way we have a steady state situation back, right? But there's a couple of problems with that. We know that the universe is expanding at an ever-increasing rate, faster and faster. And that tells us that really the universe is not going to contract because the forces of expansion are far and away greater than any forces of contraction. Okay? So, we have a problem with that one. Dr. Robert Jastrow, in his book, God and the Astronomers, he was an agnostic, and he wrote, "Astronomers now find they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began. And they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover." He says, that there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. He says, for the scientist who has lived by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. You see, this stuff that the universe once had a beginning, it changed everything. And serious astrophysicists and cosmologists are going to have to ask the question, what could have caused it? All right, let's look at the design argument. You with me? Okay. It's also known as the teleological argument, if that rings a bell, and if any of you like 6-syllable words. It goes like this. Every design had a designer. The universe has highly complex design, and therefore the universe had a designer. Right. When I went to college, I majored in mechanical engineering, went to UC Davis, and when I graduated, I remember that it was not a very good job market. Difficult for us to find jobs, but after a few months, I was able to land an engineering job. And I'm telling you, it was incredible. I loved it. I couldn't believe it. I was going to go to work for Lockheed in a small group that was on contract at NASA out at Moffett Field at NASA Ames. And I was going to get to be a starting engineer involved in the designs of hardware that would support life sciences experiments in space, biology experiments. And they had scientists, and we were hardware engineers, and it was incredible. And I can remember when I started, my boss had a plan for training, the junior engineer, and I had a great boss. And I was to spend my entire first week doing nothing but working with the checking group. That's it. And these were guys, there were about 4 or 5 of them in their 40s and 50s, and I'm 50 now, I'm a little sensitive about that. Their whole job was to check drawings when they came out of drafting. And yeah, the drafters used paper and pencil. But when a drafter finished something machined, like a bracket or a little assembly, like a cable, did you know that a cable is an assembly? Then their drawings would come over to the checking group like this, and their whole job was to proofread it and check the work. And they had a process. If anything was looked at visually, they highlighted it with a yellow highlighter. Nothing was missed, okay? And by the end, everything would be highlighted. Now, if there was a question about a number, a letter, anything at all, they would very carefully make a note in blue ink, asking the question. Now, if there was any kind of an error on that drawing at all, anywhere, it would be very carefully crossed out in red ink and reprinted perfectly in exactly what it should be. And then the drawing would go back to the design group. They would create a new revision. It would go back into the checkers. Everything would get signed off along the way. It would go to the engineer for sign-off approval. And if it got that far, it went to purchasing. It got purchased, went to the prototype lab, and built. Let's see if it works. You wouldn't believe the amount of effort and time and energy it was to push through designs like that. It was incredible. Now, a little while after that, I would move to the semiconductor industry where they didn't do any of that. Just draw it, let's buy it, see if it works and sell it, okay? We got to hurry here. But they didn't have astronauts' lives at stake, did they? And I'll tell you what, after 26 years of experience in engineering, I will never forget those guys who taught me how to properly check a drawing. It was the best training I ever received. But I'm going to suggest that every single one of you in here can recognize design when you see it just as easily as I can. Why? Well, suppose you were to come on over to our house and we walked out in the backyard and we looked up into the plum tree in the backyard and we saw one of these. We know that that's not the product of chance, right? Why? Because we know that some agent took these components and assembled them for a purpose which none of those components can do by themselves. Something had a plan that it entered into. Some little bird built a nest, right? What about these guys? I love these guys. My brother flew these in the Army. I think they were known as Death from Above, I'm not sure, but that might be the Hueys in Vietnam, these Cobra helicopters. Now, these are a good example of design because these contain hundreds of thousands of non-flying components. When they're put together, create a flying machine. It's incredible, isn't it? Somebody went into that with an incredible amount of knowledge. Same thing is true with something like Mount Rushmore. All right, here's the bottom line with design. Design is a highly improbable state of affairs that seems to be arranged for a purpose. In other words, chance is not a good explanation. You know it, and I know it. Now, take the mountain that's just over from Mount Rushmore, and we have a highly improbable state of affairs, right? There's no other mountain like it, but it doesn't achieve some kind of amazing purpose. Chance is a pretty good explanation for that mountain. All right, now I'm going to come up with an example of design in nature that is a highly improbable state of affairs that appears to have been set up for a purpose. And I'm talking about the entire universe. Why? Starting in about the 1950s, physicists started noticing different things about the universe that were very, very special, very interesting. They were different characteristics of the universe, physics, the way things were set up, or factors that seemed to be such a value that if they were just a little bit different, really just a little bit different, life could not exist at all. An example, let's talk about Newton's force of gravity. There's the equation. Very often these things for physicists manifest themselves in the constant that's in these equations. This tells us what the force of gravity is, and G is the gravitational constant. I'm not going to get lost in the weeds on that, but it's got a numerical value. Now, physicists have found out if that numerical value for G is different in just one part in 1 with 40 zeros, that's 1 part in 10,000 billion, 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 then our sun never would have formed, neither would any star like it, and we wouldn't be here. Okay? Hugh Ross would say, it's hard for us to understand these numbers, but if you take a continent the size of North America and you cover it in dimes and pile the dimes all the way to the moon, add a billion other continents the same size, put in a red dime, and you've got 10 with 37 zeros. This is incredible. It's like these different factors set up, and we're playing the game of Jenga. Have you ever heard of that game? Where your job is to pull out a block of wood and you stack it higher and you stack it higher until it's just teeter-tottering on these wood blocks, except we are sitting on the universe on a stack of knife edges. But Paul Davies, who is not a Christian, would say the cliche that life is balanced on a knife edge is a staggering understatement in this case. No knife in the universe is that fine. Another example. Einstein's cosmological constant, it shows up in his relativity equations. It has to do with the expansion rate of space or the energy density of space. If that number was different in 1 with 53 zeros, then the universe would be expanding fast enough that matter would disperse and stars and galaxies would not form, or it would collapse in on itself and it would be a disaster. 1 part in 100 million, billion, 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 billion. It's incredible. There's some 38 plus of these constants that are highly fine-tuned. That's what physics call it, is the fine-tuning of the universe. Highly fine-tuned for life. It's changing all the time. Estimates now are much higher. I tried to be very conservative. Hugh Ross puts it up over 100. These two, the gravitational constant and the cosmological constant, in combination together represent a fine-tuning of 1 part in 100 million trillion, 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 which comes down to 1 atom in the entire known universe. I don't know why everybody isn't talking about this. It's incredible. The data is undeniable by anybody who knows what they're doing. Hugh Ross tells us that virtually every research astronomer alive today agrees that the universe manifests exquisite fine-tuning for life. Roger Penrose, if we combined all the laws that must be fine-tuned, we couldn't even write down that number, since it would require more zeros than the number of particles in the universe. A highly improbable state of affairs that seems to be set up for a purpose. There are some objections. The first one I kind of like. It's one of the more common ones because it made sense to me. Really, the objection is, hey, we shouldn't be surprised. So these numbers are special. You got a bunch of numbers. You got 38, 80, 100 different constants. It's like a lottery ticket. You have a winning lottery ticket. Each one of those numbers is special, right? But you see, that's a bad analogy. A better analogy is if we're opening up a padlock and we have to get every number just right, or else we can't open it and get life. See? It's kind of like not a padlock, but a bank vault. Imagine 50 up to 100 different numbers you got to choose from on a scale of 1 million each. What are the odds that you would get life? Well, some of the physicists will say, all right, you got us. It must mean that there are an infinite number of universes out there, and we just happen to be on the lucky one. And that's known as the multiverse theory. But the problem with that is that there's no independent evidence that that can be the case. It's pure speculation. And I would say that, it's almost hard enough to explain one universe, isn't it? But with this, we would have to explain some kind of naturalistic machine which is generating universes one right after the other. And I think that it's an interesting tacit admission by a lot of these. Stephen Hawking would agree with the multiverse theory. It's kind of an admission that they agree that this is a problem. The fine-tuning of the universe is one of the most powerful arguments for the existence of God today. All right. What it means is that the cause of the universe must have been something highly intelligent. We can call it all-knowing. To go from a state of zero matter, presumably just energy, to all of the order that we see in the universe today, and purposeful. He had a plan. Okay? Reasonable. All right. Fred Hoyle had said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics. The numbers put this conclusion almost beyond question. So I think that in some cases, he's showing that he's kind of become agnostic about it. I think we're seeing more and more physicists these days moving from atheism to agnosticism, but I'm not sure. I don't know that for sure. Okay, let's take a look at the moral argument. You with me still? All right. It goes something like this. All people are conscious of an objective moral law. Objective moral laws imply a moral lawgiver, and therefore there must be a supreme moral lawgiver. All right. The picture looks something like this. Christianity would say, okay, we have a very interesting situation here. We have the world and we have the earth and with everybody on it, but separate and independent of the world and everybody is an objective moral law. It's a set of laws that tell us what is right and wrong. And this exists out here as its own entity. For example, lying, stealing, and torture are all wrong. On the other hand, generosity, equality, and sacrifice are all good things. And we know those things to be true. Okay? On the other hand, if these things weren't here, then we have lost an objective reference point on morality. And what we have left is all of us who are here on the earth. You see that? And so when any of us are talking about notions of right and wrong, we're expressing our viewpoints or our opinions, even really just our preferences in morality. It's kind of like ice cream. You like strawberry, you like vanilla, and I like chocolate. Okay? This is called moral relativism. But if we can show that moral relativism isn't the reality that we live in, and objective moral truths really exist, these things are true no matter what anybody thinks. Even if everyone on the earth was gone, these things still exist out there, and that they're true, then Christians would say, this is good evidence for the existence of God because we need to somehow account for where these came from. Right? Because they didn't come from us. All right. Do all of you remember Katharine Hepburn? Wasn't she great? You may not know that she was known for this saying. In fact, I'm curious, how many of you know that Katharine Hepburn was known for saying, if you obey all the rules, you miss all the fun? Does that ring a bell with anybody? Well, this is a life philosophy that I was very happy to live by when I was younger. When I was growing up, I had an older brother and a younger sister, and we had our skateboards, we had our bicycles, we had a little dirt bike motorcycle. My older brother had a bigger one, and we just loved doing stuff like that. And I can remember that my dad he taught us how to drive when we were all very, very young. He took us to the church parking lot, which was this great big vast expanse of asphalt. And he would teach us how to drive when we were very young. And I remember he had a Datsun 510, and I can remember I could barely reach the pedals, but he would show us how, and he would sit in the passenger seat, and he would let us kind of tool around on Saturdays in the church parking lot. There were none of those concrete things that you drive against, you know. It was all open. And we would just kind of do some circles and tool around and have a lot of fun. In fact, it was so much fun that after we all knew how to drive, we would ask him on Saturdays, Dad, would you take us to the church parking lot? Come on, please. And he would. it was great entertainment. Later on, he had a Ford Fiesta, and it was fun. So we learned how to drive like that. And I also remember when we were growing up, we had a little motorhome. And, I searched all my photo albums to try to find a picture of our motorhome, and I couldn't. I didn't have one. But I searched the internet, and I found a picture of our motorhome. One like it. You want to see what it looked like? It looked like that. Now, ours was in a little better condition, but ours was a lot like that. Okay? And we used to go as a family out on weekend getaways and things like that and go camping and on little excursions. And I can remember on one occasion, my mom was going to take me and my sister on a weekend getaway. And now I did not have my driver's license. I know that. And I might be wrong, but I'm almost certain I didn't have my learner's permit either. You got your permit at 15 and a half, but I don't think I was there. I don't think I was that old, but I could be wrong. But I asked my mom before we left, I said, "Hey, Mom, would you mind if while we're gone I did a little bit of driving?" And she said, "Okay." So we got going. The destination is the Hearst Castle down Highway 1 along the coast. And I'm telling you, it was great. I mean, I can remember driving this thing, and it was kind of like getting behind the wheel like this. It was like driving a great big bus with a great big steering wheel. And really, in my memory, it was like this. I'm sure it wasn't this big, but I was very scrawny back then. I mean, thin and lean, and strong still, not scrawny. But I'm driving this thing like this, and it was so much fun, and it's time to take a turn, and you're turning the wheel like this, and the power steering starts to hiss, and then you got to turn the other way, and it's hissing that way, and you got a windshield the size of a sheet of plywood. You can see everything everywhere. It was so much fun. And I can remember pulling out on a scenic pullout and looking down out the window, and there was a kid about my age in a car down there, and he's looking up at me, pointing, going, "What's that kid doing driving that thing?" But I don't think anybody in his car paid attention, and I just pulled away and left. It was so much fun. Now, driving around without a driver's license suited me just fine. But if somebody else thought that it was wrong, that was just their opinion, as far as I was concerned. That's a world of moral relativism. Okay? In the early years of World War II, German reserve police battalions would show up to Polish towns with a convoy of trucks early in the morning, and it would be the job of one of the companies to get out and surround and cordon off the town while the rest of them went into town. And they would go to different houses, and they would have the Jewish families come on out of the house, and everybody would congregate in the center square in town. And the older teenage boys, and maybe the younger men, would go to one part of the square in town while the rest of the families, younger brothers and sisters and moms and dads, would go to a separate part of the square in town, and they would be put on the trucks in groups of 35 or 40. Then the trucks would go on out of town, and they would pull into the forest, and they would all get down out of the trucks, where each one of them would get paired up face to face with another police officer. And they would walk out in a line down into the forest, where they would be made to lie down, and they would all be shot. Older brothers and dads would hear the shooting in the town square. Now, is there anybody in here who would say that the question of whether or not that was right or wrong is just a matter of opinion? No. Of course not. We all know that that was wrong. As a matter of fact, if anybody has any question about that, they're crazy. That was absolutely wrong. No question about it. That is absolutely true. If that's the case, then we have objective moral values. They exist like that. Okay. Besides, there are a number of problems with moral relativism. C.S. Lewis was an atheist. He was an officer in the British Army during World War I. He was wounded in battle, taking his men across no man's land, and he lived with shrapnel in his chest for the rest of his life. A little bit later, he made the decision to become a Christian after a nearly all-night-long walk and talk with one of his best friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, of The Lord of the Rings. And for Lewis, the moral argument really resonated with him. As far as he was concerned, the fact that we have objective moral truths was just the world in which we lived. There shouldn't even be a question. Are you crazy? He said, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. There are other problems with moral relativism. It's just not the world in which we live. Men, would you like your wives to be relatively faithful? Of course not. Some people may still object. And I might tell you, I would say, hey, if I didn't steal that pint of milk last night, my baby sister might have died in the middle of the night. It's that bad at home. Well, you would all tell me, look, let us help you get some milk. All right? But that doesn't make the stealing right. And we could prove it. If any one of you were to steal the milk from me, I would say that was wrong. I needed that. So no matter how we tend to justify things, it doesn't change the fact that they're wrong. These things really are wrong. One more problem with moral relativism, and it's best shown in a picture. Are you ready? Nothing is written in stone. I could tell you, I could say, hey, there is no such thing as objective moral values. And you could say, really, is that your opinion? Because I have a different opinion, and I don't really care about yours. That's what moral relativism is. So really what this tells us is that the reality in which we live is not one of moral relativism, no matter how much we hear that. It just isn't part of life. It isn't part of the real world. It's wrong. Okay. C.S. Lewis goes on to say, actually, interestingly, when we talk about different values, we seem to be comparing a standard that is perfect, don't we? He said, the moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than another. If your moral ideas can be truer and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. Okay, so what's going on here when we explore this is that not only do we know that this is the right picture of reality, we have an objective reference point that is a standard of right and wrong, things that are true, no matter whether people exist on earth or not. They're independent, but it also appears to be a standard of moral perfection. Okay? We're talking about something that is a pure, perfect standard. Now, some would say then, well, what is this thing then? Is this something that God is subject to? No, because that would imply that there's something higher than God, and that's not the case. Well, is this something that He just set up arbitrarily for us to live under as rules and regulations? And Christianity would say, no, there's a different answer. Christianity says that this absolute moral standard of perfection actually is God. It's who He is. He is morally perfect, and He provides the objective reference point that we're looking at. It's not a characteristic of God. It's not, these things aren't something that He possesses, because that would imply it's something that He could lose. But no, it's in the very character of who God is. What we're talking about is something that is absolutely morally pure, an example, infinitely just, infinitely loving, in other words, all good. Got it? Let's summarize. The cause of the universe, eternal, not physical, all-powerful, personal, intelligent, purposeful, and all good. Now, I'm going to suggest that what we're starting to see here is the God of the Bible. But did you notice that we didn't use the Bible to get here? We used some reasonable steps of logic and a little bit of science to get here. But if we wanted to, we could go into the Bible and confirm that the God that's inside there matches up to what we see here by looking at these verses, for example. Okay? And I'm not going to look at them now to save a little bit of time, but you've got them in your notes. Okay? All right. What we have here, though, is one of the biggest objections to Christianity in our day and age. Why could a good God allow so much evil and suffering in the world if He has the ability to stop it? And so I want to take a look at that question and a couple of other related questions, and then we'll be done. Okay? All right. What we need to understand is that we're talking about a God who loves us. He loves every single one of you, and He loves everybody in the whole world to a depth that you can't even imagine how much He loves you. And frankly, what we're talking about here is that He would like for us to love Him too. But He is not going to force us to love Him, because a forced love is no love at all, is it? So when God created humans, He gave us a very good gift, but a very powerful gift, the freedom to choose. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people running around out there exercising their freedom in ways that terribly, terribly hurt and injure other innocent people. And they even harm themselves. God knew what could happen, but He was willing to take the risk because our freedom was that important to Him. So, unfortunately, much of the suffering that we see in the world today is because of our own freedom. Now, some might say, well, what about diseases or natural disasters where it doesn't seem to be any one person's fault? And Christians would say, well, that's because of what happened in the very beginning. It's God's story, and since this is the Christian worldview, what we're talking about, let's summarize the story real quickly, can we? Shall we? When God created everything in the very beginning, it was perfect. A perfect paradise. There was no disease. There was no suffering, and there was no violence of any kind. And Adam and Eve, the first two people, had a wonderful relationship with God who loved them. In fact, the Bible tells us that now and again, God would come down and walk and talk with them in the cool of the day. How good does that sound for anybody who tends to get lonely once in a while? But when Adam and Eve chose to take life on their own terms against God's wishes, that's when, honestly, they ruined everything. That's when sin came down for the first time, along with all of its consequences, and it affected all of creation. And I would say that when Adam and Eve chose to eat that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we've been having a heck of an education in evil ever since then, haven't we? But that changed everything. The perfect illustration is like this. If we had a fish tank or a fish bowl, and suppose you put a couple of drops of red food coloring in the top of that, we know that the red food coloring would eventually spread down through the water and in the fish tank and down, and it would get in all the plants and the leaves and in the rocks, and it would go down into the gravel, and even the fish would take this stuff in, wouldn't they? Sin came down and affected all of creation, and Adam and Eve, they got this stuff inside them, and all of us as descendants of them have inherited this stuff. We call it a sin nature. That's what we call it. Now, one day, God is going to restore everything back to the way that it used to be, the way that it was always meant to be. But the problem is that sin's not going to be allowed inside. And that's a problem for us because we've got this stuff inside us and there isn't a thing that we can do to get rid of it. You know, some beliefs might say, hey, look, if we obey all the rules and we do all the right things, we just might be able to get into where? Heaven. But Christianity doesn't even pretend. Look, forget about it, because God is moral perfection, and we're never going to get there. There's nothing that we can do, but the good news in the Bible is, we call it the gospel, that Jesus came down and he provided a rescue plan. So that if we trust in him and what he did, he can exchange it out of us and make us right with God. That's the Christian worldview in a nutshell. And we would say that certainly diseases are a result of that original sin, because it affected all of creation. And the violence that we see in natural disasters would be a result of that too. Well, why doesn't he stop the car crash? Why doesn't God just stop the car crash or the cancer? When I was 20 years old, my cousin Guy was 18, and he was killed in a car crash. He was driving around with 3 of his friends. 2 of them were 19, 2 of them were 18. They were driving a 1969 Ford Mustang. And I remember Guy was in the back seat. And when the car hit the telephone pole, they were all killed instantly. The crash was so violent that it ripped off the whole front end of the car, and it threw the engine about 50 yards away. They were all on their way home from church choir practice, or some church function. I think it was church choir practice, but I can't really remember. But they were on their way home from church. I don't know if any of us can know why it happens when it happens, can we? We don't know. But we can know 2 things. We can know that God in his sovereignty really is in control over all things. And we can know that he loves us. He will always love us. That never changes. So that means that if he allows us to enter into a period of terrible suffering, terrible hurt, terrible tragedy, terrible, terrible things, it's because he's got a reason. He's got a purpose in it. There's meaning in it. And I would say at least that's something that we can hang on to when we're in it, that there's meaning in it. And that's better than the alternative where there's no meaning at all, isn't it? I think that for Christians, very often it means that God has a plan for your life that you're not even aware of. It could be that sometime in the future you help somebody else out who is going through the same thing, and your involvement in that for all those people at some point in the future has profound effects for all those people for the good. You don't know. I think for non-Christians, very often, God allows us to go through things like that because he might be trying to get our attention. Why doesn't he just destroy evil? Well, we know that one day God will defeat evil. He hasn't done it yet. We don't know why. Many people suspect that in his foreknowledge, he knows that many people are still going to choose to love him. And he's waiting. He's waiting. Well, why doesn't he just show himself more clearly then? Why not? Why doesn't he just show up in the sky? Well, if God showed up in the sky and showed himself more clearly in that way and compelled belief, then he would to some extent be controlling our freedom to choose, wouldn't he? And some people would say if that were to happen, we would see feigned love all over the world. The Bible claims that we have enough information in nature to know that an intelligent creator exists. And if we go to the Bible, knowing because of the evidence that it's reliable, then we can get the rest of the story. I like the way Frank Turek put this. He said, for you ladies out there, have you ever had a guy that really liked you, but you didn't feel the same for him, but he didn't get a hint, and he kept on calling and showing up everywhere, and then he didn't take no for an answer, and it was all very awkward and difficult and embarrassing. If that guy really loved you, wouldn't he leave you alone? And that's kind of how God is. I think sometimes He'll send us a note every once in a while just to remind us that He's there. And I think that comes in the form of little things that happen in our lives that we know are just beyond coincidence. I used to believe more in coincidences, but now that I'm 50, to be honest with you, I'm just starting to trust my own intuition more. I don't care what anybody says. If something's telling me, hey, we're dealing with something here that is beyond coincidence, I'm just going to believe myself because I think I have enough experience now. And if any of you happen to be dealing with these little things in your life, let me assure you that you're in good company. Because that has been true in my life many times, and it's been true in the life of every Christian that I know. Usually before we become Christians, when He's starting to get our attention. But you know what? It keeps on happening afterwards, time and time again. He has His way of just letting us know, making Himself known to us. This is not some big man in the sky telling us what to do, folks. He gives us the freedom to choose. And all I want to do, I want to just make sure everybody knows what the choice is. We have an intelligent Creator out there, and He's inviting us to know Him. And if we choose to be on His side, He's going to take care of us forever. Forever. All right, time is up. I'm going to stop with a prayer in about 20 seconds. But first, I just want to let you know I'm going to stick around and we're going to talk about questions, anybody who wants to. Notice I didn't say I'm going to answer questions because I don't know. I don't have all the answers. But one thing I've learned is that we don't have to be afraid of the big questions because Christianity's got the answers. And I like to talk about them, so I'll be here next week. First 10 people are going to get this book on creation, and this is unbelievable. It's very easy to read and answers every question you could ever have about creation. So come here early. I'm peddling my next talk, in case you didn't notice. Let's say a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank You so much that we can get together like this in this church and just freely talk about who You are. And that we can remember that no matter what we hear around us, You are good. And Lord, I ask that You would just be with every one of these folks here tonight as they leave. Take them home safely and keep them through the week safely and bring them back next week. And all these things, I thank You. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you and good night.